Today, what I'd like to do is take you through these two divine fools, how these lives are basically parallel. And so I wanted to kind of look at similarities between the two and how they really function in our culture in the same way. We start with something that's tragic. Both of them lost a parent early in their lives. We talked last week about C.S. Lewis losing his mother when he was 10 years old to cancer. And he prayed, and yet God did not seem to answer his prayers. And so this really was a traumatic experience for him up in Ireland. Colbert also, when he was about 10, his father and two of his brothers closest in age to him, Peter and Paul, were killed in a plane crash. And this was a traumatic. He was in a Roman Catholic family of around 11 children. They were very devout. His father was the dean of Yale Medical School. And so he was a very significant person down in Savannah, Georgia. But when they died, Stephen was the youngest child and lived at home with his mother. And he remembered his mother wearing black every day and going to Mass every day and grieving. And he said, yet what I learned from her was she was broken but not bitter. She learned to say thank you to God for whatever God had brought into their lives. And this will become a running theme for him. And so you see from the beginning, both of them in one sense are orphaned and left with one parent. Now both were outsiders to the environments they actually moved to. We find that C.S. Lewis was Irish. Stephen Colbert was Irish. Those Irish, they can drink and they can talk. And so we find these two kind of coming back to their Irish backgrounds. But Colbert was born down in South Carolina. And so you find him down there moving from his roots there. You remember he ran for president and was kind of the president of South Carolina for a while during one of the elections. But both of them moved from Ireland moved from their roots to somewhere else. Both sought to escape school bullies. Now, Lewis was kind of a tubby boy for growing up, and he said, I was not athletic at all. I had no joints in my thumbs, so I could not kind of play sports like other boys. In fact, he hated sports. He hated playing football, our soccer. And so what he would do is he would go and hide in the library. In the same way, he said, there was my face. When I was trying to look humble, people would come to me and say, take that look off your face. He said, but when I was trying to look insolent or truculent, they would never notice. When he was trying to be sarcastic, they wouldn't pick up on it. But when he was trying to be just ordinary, they would jump on him. Like Lewis, Colbert wasn't too popular when he went to a new school. He said he was beaten up on a regular basis. Now, when you are short and you love books, you find that you become a bit precocious. And people will pick on you because you can get them with your words. So where they found sanctuary was in reading. Lewis would run to the library at his school. And so all of the bullies and the tarts that were there would kind of leave him alone because he was alone in the library. Nobody else ever goes to the library. When you're on a university campus, that's the quietest place because there's no one there. Colbert, on the other hand, loved books. He would hide himself in his room. And he said he wanted books for his birthday, for Christmas, for confirmation. He could never get enough books. And he was always reading. Lewis was reading Norse mythology and Greek mythology and everything he could, learning several languages by the time he was 15. And Colbert was just immersing himself in Tolkien and a lot of other kind of mythology there. But both lost their faith at an early age. Looking back, they saw the tragedy of their life and they began to ask questions of how could a good God allow such suffering. And they began to kind of question everything they had learned in their churches. But both of them have remarkable conversion stories when they had come of age. The first is Lewis, and we have the portrait of an Irish poet as a young atheist. He was brash, he was presumptuous, and he was well-read and thought he was quite intelligent. But what he did when he began to read Dante and Milton and Shakespeare and Coleridge, he found that God kept interrupting his reading. He said, a sound atheist cannot be too careful of what he reads. There are traps everywhere, says the poet George Herbert. When you lay open the Bible, there are millions of surprises. There are fine nets and strategies of God to kind of pull you in. Lewis concludes, God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous. He has ways of getting into our minds. And you remember Flannery O'Connor, who said, our culture is Christ-haunted, that no one can escape the love of Christ, the grace of Christ. I just wrote a book called God on the Big Screen. It's a history of prayer from the silent era to today. And I'm writing an article now on the Oscars coming up. And did you realize how many films nominated for Oscars have prayers in them? 1917, Little Women, Harriet, Just Mercy. You go on, and all of these films have prayers. Why are the prayers there? Because scriptwriters cannot get away from this kind of essential hunger for God. And so it keeps coming out. And then in September 1931, Lewis by then is about 33. He's an adult. And he has these debates with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugh Dyson. Hugh Dyson is quite the character. He's the one that hated the elves we talked about last week in Tolkien's writing. And so they would go out and they would debate. And one night in that September, they took a walk along Addison's Walk. And Addison's Walk is behind Magdalen College. And if you go to Oxford, you need to take this walk. It's just beautiful, this tree-lined. And it's almost just transcendent and sublime. Now, back behind Magdalen College, they also have sheep. And the sheep are there, and whenever there's a sheep for every dawn, or they have deer for every dawn. Every dawn's a professor, so every professor has his own deer. When that professor dies, they kill one of the deer and have dinner of that professor's dawn. Now, hopefully when one of the deer died, they did not kill the dawn. That's the other thing. But Lewis and his two friends were walking this walk, and suddenly in this kind of September evening, fall, beautiful evening, the leaves were all over, and there was a rush of wind, this ruha, this spiritus that came over them, and they just kind of stopped and trembled because they had been arguing about the idea of a dying God. Every culture seems to have this myth of the dying God. There's Egyptian god Ra. There is Balder in Norse mythology. There's the corn god. Corn god dies every year and comes back to life the next year. And so the story of the dying God is in every culture, and Lewis had no problems with that. But they said, you have a problem because it actually became true once. In the Jewish faith, there is this Jew who comes along and claims to be God. He dies and he comes back to life. It's mythic and it's historical. And this began to kind of transform Lewis's thinking on this, and he that night became kind of a theist, and within several weeks would become a Christian. Stephen Colbert, on the other hand, was a young actor as an atheist. He too lost his faith, and he went to Hampton-Sydney, which didn't help. Hampton-Sydney is one of Virginia Wesleyan's rivals, so I can mock them all the time as an atheist school. Of course, we are too, but never mind. But here he was an atheist and decided to go transfer to Northwestern University in Chicago. And he wanted to be a serious dramatic actor. He saw his calling in something like Iago and Othello, something that was heavy. But what that brought with him was the kind of anxiety you have with being an artist. And so he was full of worry. He was full of depression. And there was one winter evening when he was out walking and he didn't know what to do with his life. And this little old man came up and looked at him and handed him one of those little green New Testaments with the Proverbs and the Psalms in it. And he took it and it was frozen. He couldn't do anything with it. And so he kind of tried to crack it open. He just had to crack it open. And when he did, he looked and there was a page that said, when you're feeling one of these emotions, here's where you look in Scripture. And so he looked up anxiety. And as he came to anxiety, it said, go to Matthew 5. And in Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, those who are worried, don't worry. Look at the sparrows. Look at the lilies of the field. They don't worry, and yet God takes care of them. And suddenly a peace came over him. And he was also kind of restored to the faith of his youth. He said, there's something about this word that is drawing me back to the faith. And so Colbert became a Christian. And that week, later on that week, what he did, he went to Second City Troupe in Chicago. He saw comedy. He started laughing, and he realized, my calling is not in drama or tragedy. It's in comedy. I'm called to be funny. And so you find this conversion and then this calling coming together at this time. He chose St. Peter as his favorite saint because of Peter's flaws. Colbert confessed, I suck as a Catholic. But he says, I got to keep practicing. Most of us need to keep practicing being Episcopalians, good Episcopalians, because we're not too good yet. And that's an encouragement for all of us to do that. Both affirm the central orthodox doctrines of the Apostles' Creed and mere Christianity. Both of them say that what the church has taught, what scriptures have taught us, we believe and we affirm. And so you'll find, even on Ash Wednesday, that Colbert will go to the Ash Wednesday service first and be marked with the cross, and then come on his show. And the one thing that he was serious about were the doctrines of the church. Not the church, as we'll see. He could poke the church, but the faith of Jesus Christ he would not. Now, both men possessed a tremendous photographic memory. We see here John Stewart just acknowledging that what they had read, both of them had read so much as young men, that it was really saturated. They were immersed in what they saw. Lewis was the kind of person, you go into a study and you could begin a quote on Spenser from the Faerie Queene and he would complete it for you. You could start any line from Shakespeare. He knew it right off. This man's mind was incredible. Of course, they were both single for a long time, and that helped as well. Okay. Both are public intellectuals and also philosophical bullies. They are men who go into the public square and they use their minds. Lewis found that his colleagues at Oxford would not accept him because he was an Orthodox Christian. And yet he would go and he would argue with them. He was not afraid of taking his faith into a debate. They're also kind of bullies, as we'll find. Lewis even bullied his own friends. One was Charles Williams, the friend we talked about last week who died during the war. But he would look at Charles Williams and say he looked like a monkey. You are ugly, Charles. U-G-L-Y, you're ugly. And he would carry that on, and his friends still loved him. He looked at Tolkien. He said, he is a pale, fluent little chap, but he needs a smack every now and then. And so you see this kind of roughness, but men who enjoy each other can do this to one another. You can mock. And I think when I am with my friends, particularly this 90-year-old cartoonist, John Loyne, he and I and several other friends meet every kind of Friday morning. And we find that we are still taunting and mocking each other for mistakes we've made 40, 50 years ago. But there's something that's so affirming about that, because you're acknowledging and confessing your sins even while you're seeking forgiveness. Colbert could also decimate his guests. He could bully people. For example, there was the one time when the House Representative Lynn Westmoreland came on Colbert's show, and he was arguing that every school should have the 10 Commandments posted in it. And so Colbert asked him, he said, well, what are the 10 Commandments? Westmoreland could name 2. So he was able to take him 10 Commandments, as Mel Brooks said, for all to obey. He did not realize that you have to know the 10 Commandments before you can espouse them, and just demoralized him. Amy Sedaris, another comedian, recognized what she called the bully bull Taurus in Colbert. He was able to take people who were arrogant or presumptuous and just poke the bear, just enough to kind of make them realize they were not in charge. In fact, if you remember the Colbert Report, and this is what kind of struck me for this whole kind of talk, and it's been developing. It comes with all of these kind of descriptive words. When it opens up, you see invincible, which is kind of fun. He's mocking himself. Then you have star-spangled. It shows his kind of faux patriotism there. Then you have all beef. What the heck that means, who knows? But the one that stymied me would come at the end, and nobody ever took it seriously, was sanctified. Sanctified. That is a theological term. It means that God is working in you. No one outside the church uses the term sanctified, and yet it was one of his key terms that was there. Both of them celebrate male camaraderie. You come together, you mock each other, you love each other, you talk to each other, you need each other to keep each other humble. And so Jon Stewart and Colbert would be together. And Lewis defines his first and second friends. The first friend is the friend that agrees with you on everything. The two of you can go anywhere and you can look at something and you know what the other friend is thinking. Second friends are people that are interested in the same thing you are, but they disagree with you completely about everything. They're very much like a wife, okay? You're interested in the same things, but there's going to be something that is just different. And it's iron rubbing against iron. But it's wonderful to have those friends, and you can kind of test them. And so Lewis had both kinds, and they would meet in the Eagle and Child. In the Eagle and Child, the Baby and the Bird was this place over in Oxford where they would go on Tuesday morning and read their readings to one another and talk and debate and do nonsense and everything else. Lewis would meet with this group called the Inklings. And here we have Anthony Hopkins playing C.S. Lewis in the movie Shadowlands, which is really was very unfortunate because you remember he was also Hannibal Lecter. And so C.S. Lewis and Hannibal Lecter just really didn't kind of conflate for me too well until you realize that now he's the Pope, okay? So even Hannibal Lecter can be saved. It's wonderful to see what happens with all of these things. Good, okay. Both had a friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis, of course, by nature of being a literature professor and being in little groups with him, one called the Coal Biters, where they'd sit so close to the fire and read Norse mythology, the other called the Inklings, and they were so dear throughout. Tolkien always wanted him to become a Roman Catholic, but he never did. He just found the faith in the Anglican way. But what we find that in Lewis's writing, he also acknowledges the role that Tolkien had in saving him, of being his ransom. The hero of his science fiction trilogy is Ransom, a man called Ransom. He's a philologist. Tolkien was a philologist. Tolkien was the ransom. He was the one who led Lewis into the Christian faith. And so you find this character being Tolkien in Lewis's fiction. And Tolkien would return the favor. In his fiction, The Lord of the Rings, there is a Lewis. Does anyone know who it is? Treebeard. You get a book. There's a book for you today. No, I'm kidding. Treebeard. Tolkien modeled Treebeard on this blustering Lewis. Lewis just would be kind of this man who would come into the classroom and he would speak like, "Tree, I am no tree. I am an ant." And Lewis had this kind of presence that people would cower before him. But we find here that Tolkien is returning the favor, and so they play with each other in their friendship. Now, Colbert was this nerd for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He loved the stories. He memorized the story. And so Entertainment Weekly would dress him up in different costumes where he could be Gandalf or Bilbo, whoever it was with his precious ring. He becomes the ultimate Tolkien nerd. Peter Jackson, the director of the film, said in Entertainment Weekly, Colbert is not a geek, he's the king geek. He knows everything. And just to show that, he had a debate with the actor James Franco. And so Franco thought he knew Tolkien and everything about Lord of the Rings, and he wanted to have a Tolkien showdown. And Colbert said, "Last time we were here and had a Tolkien showdown, I smoked you like a ham." So Franco says, "I've been rereading the Silmarillion lately. Name me just two of the Valar." And Colbert says, "Do you want the Valor of Water, Olmo? Or do you want the Hunter of the Valor, Oromi? Or do you want the Valor of the Trees, Yavanna? Or do you want the Craftsman of the Valor, Aoi? Or do you want his wife, Varda, called the Eberline by the elves, who kindled the stars? Or do you want the Lord of the Airs, Manwë? You come into my house," okay? "How dare you?" And so basically Colbert just hammed him again, roasted him, and showed that he knew nothing about Tolkien. Both perform as ironic satirists and are hard to understand at different times. For Lewis, it was as Screwtape and the Screwtape Letters. It was the hardest thing he had to write in one sense, because you get this kind of gritty feel of how do you reverse goodness and evil. And he was able to talk, and it's one of the best books of psychology that you can find. He looks at temptation in all of our lives, and there's something in there you recognize. He knows the heart of man. And someone said, well, how did you write in such a way? Did you read a lot of moral theology? And he said, no. I just looked at my own heart. And when we're honest, we see how we sin, and then you look around the room, those are the same sinners. In fact, they're worse than you are. Colbert had his kind of ironic voice like Kierkegaard on his show. And his strong Roman Catholic and biblical roots on social justice called people to look at themselves. And one of his most famous time was before Congress, when he tried to point them back. And he wrote, if this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit that we just don't want to do it. The indictment was there. And we need continually to be confronted by each other to say, what are we doing that is of the kingdom, and what are we not doing that is there? Now, both men are viewed suspiciously by other Christians, often for smoking, drinking, and naughty language. Bob Jones Jr., the fundamentalist from South Carolina, went and visited Lewis over in Oxford. And he came back and he said to his father, that man smokes, that man drinks, but that man's a Christian. And it was this kind of dichotomy. How do you kind of create these two worlds together? But Lewis began to kind of open up fundamentalists to the fact there's something else going on there. There's also the story of when Lewis and his friends were drinking in the Eagle and Pub, kind of this fundamentalist came in and looked at them and saw them drinking so much wine and beer. And the person said, I'd rather commit adultery than do what you're doing. And they said, so would we, but we're going to stick to our beer. Okay. Both had pulpits. University Church of St. Mary's is where Lewis gave his great sermon, The Weight of Glory and Learning in Wartime. And Colbert had Comedy Central and now The Late Show. But my fun thing is both mock the apostate hierarchy of the church. They attack the church and the leaders and its corruption more than anyone else. And there were so many kind of hip Anglican clergy of his day that were denying the kind of resurrection and other things. And so he takes them to task in The Great Divorce. Colbert would do the same with arrogant Episcopalians. When one kind of bishop came on, he says, in joining the Episcopal Church is like advanced placement religion. It's for thinking people. So I guess that means atheism is for people smart enough to test out of it. So he's able to kind of poke and say, listen, no, it's for those people who need God. Both celebrated the Jewish foundation of faith. Just really wherever it was, they celebrated being Jewish. And it goes back to Lewis, who wrote the Reflections on the Psalms, a wonderful kind of study of the Hebrew poetry. And it helped him understand the Hebrew mindset and gratitude and just the robust faith that they had and brought in. In 1933, he actually wrote and denounced Adolf Hitler in the London Times. And he said, this is wrong. This is 10 years or 8 years before the war begins. But he looks at this fascism. He will create these kind of monsters in his fiction, is there. And then he celebrates a Jewish woman in The Great Divorce, Sarah Smith, whom everybody loves. And later he will marry the Jewish author who read his works and became a Christian because of him, Joy Davidman. And so this kind of Jewishness, they recognized our roots. And if we forget our roots, that we are part of this whole great tradition, we have lost where we stand. Colbert had Yahweh or no way. Yahweh was Moses is Yahweh. So you say Yahweh when I go like that. Moses is Wizard of Oz is? No way, okay? You began to kind of contrast what is of God and what isn't of God. There was one kind of Baptist pastor down south who was calling his congregation to practice sex 7 days a week. And Colbert said, Yahweh or no way? No way. He says, even the Lord rested on the seventh day. Okay? Both have rebranded in a way or retranslated the Christian faith for their generation. In other words, they have opened up the windows of the gospel with a fresh breeze coming in. And part of that was their joy, the hilaritas. The hilaritas was one of the original kind of 8 blessed virtues by Evagrius in the 5th century. And they go back to it. And you find their impact is all over. Wall Street Journal reported several years ago that so many books of Mere Christianity are still being sold. Not that they're being read, but they're being sold. They are being read in China, which is really quite remarkable. And what I have found is that there are different groups that are coming to Lewis that are changing them. Last semester, I taught C.S. Lewis. I had a Mormon student, a very bright Mormon student from Utah, Salt Lake City. And she went through, and everything Lewis was saying, she was agreeing with. And so finally I said, you know, doesn't Joseph Smith and everything else? She says, Lewis is our favorite author. For the Church of Latter-day Saints to come and find that Lewis is supplanting Joseph Smith says there may be something going on in the Mormon church that we don't understand. And so doctrine, he is coming in and beginning to kind of infiltrate different places. Now, both debated those who disagreed with them. Lewis in the Socratic Club, he is the first Oxford scholar to go over to a women's college. He went over to Somerville College and he established a debating society. And many of his male colleagues kind of rejected him for that, saying, how can you go with the women? But he said, they are thinking. And so you find this wonderful kind of sense. With Dorothy Sayers over there, this wonderful author, he went over and he established this club where he would invite Marxists and atheists and psychologists who didn't believe, and they would debate in a public forum. And he would there. Colbert, in the same way, would take up people like Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo. And Philip Zimbardo came along with this idea, the Lucifer effect, where it said God created hell. Paradoxically, it was God who created hell as a place to put Lucifer and his angels. And had he not created hell, evil would not exist. Lewis says, Colbert, I get them mixed up now. Colbert says, Satan used his free will and abused it by disobeying authority. Hell was created by Satan's disobedience to God and his purposeful removal from God's love. No, he says, evil exists because of the disobedience of Satan. God gave Satan, the angels, and man free will, which is what hell is, removing yourself from God's love. You send yourself to hell. God does not send you there. And so after really kind of demolishing him in this, you find that this condescending response by Zimbardo. He said, obviously, you learned well in Sunday school. To which Colbert responded, I teach Sunday school, mother fudgicle. Was one of the great moments of the comedy. Okay. Both have been on Time magazine. And kind of in 1948, we find Lewis there, and then we find Colbert. And both have been celebrated as kind of cultural icons who have changed the culture in some way. You also find that Colbert gives what is called the celebrity bump. If you put his name on something, you will find that you'll be elected to office, your books will sell more, you'll become more popular with the Colbert bump. So he gives the bump to different people that would come on his show. If you use his name, or if you used Lewis's name, you would get a bump. Authors still exploit it. These are my 3 books. Lewis, Colbert, and Lewis. And they made more money for me than any other book. So it's there, just to kind of throw that in. Okay. Both retain spiritual confession. They both go to confessors. And this is something I think we've lost perhaps in the Anglican Church, where we actually confess our sins to one another. We need to find someone whom we can trust, and just don't pull them all on Wynn. He'll be overwhelmed. He'll be depressed. You find someone that you can trust and tell your sins to. It should be our spouses, but there are even others that we go to. And both of these men found that they could find clerics who were not part of their church, or someone that they could go and talk to and tell about their struggles and their doubts and everything they were going through. And it was a very healthy thing for both of them. Father Martin is very funny too, because Father Martin would tell stories with Colbert of how a young novice came to a monastery on the feast of St. Ignatius. And they were all called to obey. And on that day, a feast was there of St. Ignatius, which they had meat and fish and vegetables and fruit and cakes and sweets and wine and beer. And so the novice came in and he said, wow, if this is poverty, show me chastity. Okay. Neither was afraid of being a fool for Christ. Lewis would write and speak publicly on the BBC. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd be either a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. For him to say this on the BBC during wartime, when the most popular voice was Churchill, but he was second most recognizable, and for his colleagues at Oxford to hear it meant he put himself on the front line. He put his credibility out there to be challenged. Now, both also challenged the political establishment. Paul Begala, I think that's how you pronounce it, but he was on the club, and he was talking about how he was trying to get Bill Clinton to kind of reduce his big kind of windy talks into kind of small sound bites. And he says he just wouldn't do it. And so he said, what I had to show Bill Clinton was John 3:16. And he looked at Colbert and he says, you know what John 3:16 is? And at that moment, without looking at anything, Colbert says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes on him should live and not die. And it was just amazing. He said, and they both said, this is the Christian soundbite. And Begala says, yes, 5 seconds, less. It's something that you can give to one another. We end kind of looking at their folly. And G.K. Chesterton said, no reader can accuse me of trying to make a fool of someone else. I am the fool of my own story, and no rebel shall hurl me from my throne. Both of them were free to act the fool. Now, there are 3 kinds of fools in Scripture. There's the proverbial fool who says there is no God. There's the professional or prophetic fool, like you find the fool in King Lear, who is there to speak to power. And then there is the fool for Christ's sake, that person who is not afraid to be who they are and to say what they think. And so Colbert advised, particularly young people, he said, and this gets back to our talk last week about the dwarves being cynical. Remember, you cannot be both young and wise. Young people who pretend to be wise to the ways of the world are mostly just cynics. Cynicism masquerades as wisdom, but is the farthest thing from it, because cynics don't learn anything. Because cynicism is a self-imposed blindness, a rejection of the world because we are afraid it will hurt us or disappoint us. Cynics always say no, but saying yes begins things. Saying yes is how things grow. Saying yes leads to knowledge. Yes is for young people. So for as long as you have the strength to, say yes. Now my son wishes at least one woman would say yes, but that's another kind of story. But the idea here is that we have a God, the God of yes. The God who comes to us and affirms and says, go, I love you, I am with you always. An interviewer once asked Colbert what he would like to ask Pope Francis if he could get him on the show. And Colbert said that he would applaud this Pope and ask him about being a fool for Christ. St. Francis was known as the fool for Christ. He was not afraid to be who he was and to be with the weak and the lowly. And so Colbert and Lewis, the same thing. Colbert has another kind of father confessor, Thomas Rosica. And recently he was on with him on his program, and what really struck me was he got on there and the priest asked him, where did you get your idea of laughter and holy laughter? And he said, C.S. Lewis. He begins to look at the Screwtape Letters, the 11th epistle in the Screwtape Letters, which is all about laughter, the 4 kinds of laughter. The laughter of flippancy, where you laugh at people, the laughter of the joke, the laughter of fun, when you take a child and you throw the child up in the air and the child comes down, and what does the child say when you do that? Do it again. You throw the child back and do it again, and you get really painful. But you realize that is fun, and you laugh during that. And then the laughter of joy. The laughter of joy which kind of overwhelms us, and we realize that everything is going to be good. So here, Colbert recognizes the source of a lot of his ideas of humor are from Lewis. They were both, as we mentioned, acquainted with grief. Lewis wrote A Grief Observed about the death of his wife, Joy Davidman, and how that left an emptiness in him, and how in the first couple chapters he raises his puny fist against the brass heavens and tries to understand what is going on. And here, grief is something, and you work your way through it. And it was something that was meaningful. And for both men, suffering and loss is tied to faith. That one cannot understand one's faith unless one begins to wrestle with suffering. And so when Colbert looks back to the death of his brothers and his father, and Lewis to his friends, his mother, and his wife, they begin to realize something else is there. And Colbert kind of explained, he said, when my father died and when my brothers died, I couldn't understand it, but my mother was always so full of gratitude. She thanked God. And she said, I love the thing that I most wish had not happened. Because she said, I want to show gratitude to God for whatever happens in my life. Because He will come and give that peace which passes understanding. He will come and make sense of it. And in the final analysis, when we get to heaven, it will become all clear. And so Colbert took that same idea that he says, and he got this from a letter from Tolkien. Tolkien once wrote, what punishments of God are not gifts? So when things come into your life, you've got to say, God, what are you trying to teach me? What are you giving me? Even the small resentments we have, even when someone cuts us off in traffic, even all of these things, what is God giving us and trying to teach us? And we forget that we are still students of God, as these two men realized that God was working in their life, not only in blessing, but in times that were tough. And so we end. Both were surprised by joy. For Lewis, joy is the serious business of heaven. I mean, what attracts people to the faith but your joy? Not your debate, not your intellectual ideas, your arguments, but it is your love of the others and your joy that comes with it. And Colbert had a note taped on his computer that read, joy is the most infallible sign of the existence of God. So both of them end with this delight. Both of them end as fools, but both of them end with joy. Thank you.
I understand Joy had two sons, but I've never heard much about C.S. Lewis' relationship with them. Are they still living?
David and Douglas. David, both when their mother died, they had very different reactions. And there's a book called The Magician's Nephew, which is about a boy's mother dying, and what is the boy about to die, what does the boy do? And Douglas really embraced the Christian faith that his stepfather had. And Lewis adopted them both. He paid their way through school. He took them in. David wanted to get back to his Jewish roots. And so he joined a Kabbalah for a while. He went to India, but he was never a happy boy. Kind of a bipolar dysfunction at times. And so David ended up dying. And there are different kind of stories about it, but he died and just was an unhappy boy, unhappy young man. Douglas, on the other hand, became the curator of the Lewis estate. He still goes around. I've been with him several times. He's really almost a caricature. He wears kind of a white turtleneck and this giant medallion, kind of a big medallion. And he pontificates like his stepfather. He has a way of using this resonant voice to call people to listen to him and to overwhelm them. So he can be a bully too, but he's fun. I like to poke him as well. But he is the one who has really enabled a lot of things to happen. He was behind the kind of the three movies that started from the Chronicles of Narnia, and so has been there, but been very generous. He also has a retreat center in Ireland for burned out ministers that I think Wynn is going to next week. No, I'm kidding. But he's very generous. The other thing about these two men is their generosity. Colbert has set up a fund, a Catholic fund, for helping those in need. Lewis gave all the proceeds from all of his books to the poor. In fact, he, at the end of the year, when the tax season came along, he didn't have the money to pay his taxes because he'd given everything away from the millions of pounds that came in from his books. He just gave them all away. If you wrote to Lewis and asked for 100,000 pounds, he would send it. So until his friend Owen Barfield, a lawyer, came along and said, Lewis, you're not helping yourself. Let me set up a fund for you. They set up the estate and they kind of rescued it. But both of them were very generous with everything they had.
A friend of mine who's not particularly religious came to me a month or so ago and said, God spoke to me this morning. I said, okay. He said, I mean, it was a firm voice. It's like nothing I've ever heard before. And what he said was this: I gave you this life to enjoy it.
I think there's a sense of what that enjoyment really is. And that's the question. How are you going to enjoy it? You're going to become a glutton? You're going to become a drunk? You're going to become greedy? As Lewis said, if you're looking for a religion that's going to make you happy, I don't recommend Christianity. He says, I recommend a bottle of port, okay? But it's not going to last very long. If you serve yourself, you are not going to enjoy life. If you begin to enjoy God and enjoy others, you find that you are blessed. And so enjoyment is something that God gives to us. It's a gift of God, I really believe. And laughter is one of those gifts. But if it's all kind of self-directed, it's going to kind of rot and wither. It's going to fester like a flower. So yeah, let's enjoy, but do good.
One of the slides was talking about punishment as a gift from God or something like that, and how, and so is Colbert saying that tragedy, or they're not saying tragedy comes from God, right?
He said tragedy happens, and yet God in his permissive will allows these things to happen, and he wants to bring good out of it. It gets back to the basic idea that unless a seed dies, it's not going to produce fruit. Unless there's death. Death is a part of our life. It's not just the result of the fall, that it's a punishment. But there's something else in death that we are called to learn. And so both of them are trying to understand that and wrestle with that. And they don't come to a kind of a clear idea of what that really is rationally. But intuitively and imaginatively, they know that it's part of a plan. That this is not all. There's something else. It points to something else. So it's one of the more enigmatic statements that he makes, but I find it very fascinating. Okay, look at the sinner beside you and say, enjoy life. Thank you for coming.